Ahead on Straight Talk, a federal rollback that could change how 45 million acres of national forests are managed.
Freeing up our forests so that we're allowed to take down trees and make a lot of money.
The Trump administration moves to rescind the 2001 Roadless Rule, potentially opening land to new roads and timber projects.
Nobody in my industry wants to go and cut every tree in the forest. That is not the objective.
What the change could mean here in Oregon and why environmental activists are speaking out against it. Plus,
it's definitely like a staple for September in Portland.
A Portland tradition as summer turns to fall, with the star of the show noticeably absent.
To see them leave the Chapman area is a little surprising, but not totally unusual.
Vox's Swifts breaking their annual tradition to swirl above the Chapman Elementary chimney. But where have they gone?
It's a little bit of a mystery.
We sit down with an expert from the Oregon Bird Alliance to learn more about what could be driving them away and where you could see them instead. Right now on Straight Talk. Hello and welcome to Straight Talk. I'm Stephanie Domerat. Last week, the Trump administration took the next step toward rescinding the 2001 Roadless Rule, a move that would impact about 45 million acres of national forest lands. The administration argues it would help in firefighting efforts and allow local control of land, while critics argue it would do more harm than good. Joining us to break this down and what ending the Roadless Rule would mean is Professor Dan Rolfe. Professor Rolfe teaches a variety of courses at the Lewis and Clark Law School, including public lands law and wildlife law. He's also a co-founder of Earthrise Law, the law school's environmental law clinic. Also joining us today is Steve Pettery, conservation director for the organization Oregon Wild. Through his work at Oregon Wild, Pettery works to protect and restore Oregon's natural landscapes. That includes a combination of public education, outreach, direct lobbying, and partnerships. Dan, Steve, thanks so much for coming on the show. I appreciate your time.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Let's dive right into this, but first for viewers and just to give us context, Dan, can you talk about why this Roadless Rule was put in place in the first place and what it is?
Sure. The Roadless Rule was put into place at the end of the Clinton administration in the late 1990s. And that time was really kind of an inflection point for the Forest Service. So the Forest Service is an agency within the federal government's Department of Agriculture. It manages almost 200 million acres of national forests. Those are all public lands. They're owned by you and I. Roadless areas, the Forest Service for many years, especially in states like Oregon that has a lot of valuable timber resources, the Forest Service for many years cut a lot of trees for commercial timber harvest purposes. So that means the federal agency allows commercial logging companies to cut those trees. But in the 1990s, there was this resource of lands that were not commercially logged, that did not have a lot of roads on them. The Forest Service is essentially the largest road building entity in the world. There's almost 375,000 miles of roads in national forests throughout the United States. In the late 1990s, there were millions of acres of national forests that were less accessible, more difficult to get to, that had generally not been commercially logged. There generally were not a lot of roads. So the question was, what do we do with this resource? There was extensive public involvement effort at that time, millions of people, there were hundreds of hearings around the country. And ultimately, the Forest Service decided to manage that roadless resource, essentially, for values like wildlife. Roadless areas are very important watersheds, actually, that provide a lot of water for cities, municipalities. Bend, Oregon, for example, its municipal watershed is in a roadless area. Water quality here in Oregon, salmon and other fish depend on that water. A lot of people for recreation. So the Forest Service decided to largely manage those areas for their roadless qualities and for those sort of environmental and environmental services like water quality, like wildlife. It didn't set those aside like wilderness areas. There are still activities that are allowed in those areas, grazing, for example, economic activity not exempt and not banned by the roadless rule. But the Forest Service decided to manage those areas primarily for their wilderness, for their wild qualities.
Okay, Steve, I want to ask you specifically in Oregon how much land this would include, the roadless rule, if it's rescinded. How much land this would include in Oregon, and what areas that viewers would be familiar with as well?
Yes, it's about 2 million acres in Oregon that are currently protected under the roadless rule. Viewers will probably recognize places like Lost Lake on Mount Hood, Larch Mountain in the Columbia Gorge, the Oregon Dunes from Florence all the way down to Coos Bay on the coast, and then the hiking trails that everyone loves southwest of Bend in the Cascade Lakes area. Those are all inventoried roadless areas, at least partially inventoried roadless areas. And I think to follow up on Dan's point, when I talk about these places to people, I generally describe them as these are really wildlands. You think about them as places that weren't heavily logged. They never had heavy development on them. They're sort of the last places we have left in America's national forest system that are still managed mostly for nature. And you can do things like you can ride your mountain bike, you can go hiking, horseback riding, hunting, fishing, all the things we love to do on public lands. And the federal government can fight fires, they can do thinning and prescribe burns. You just can't do things that change the wild character of these places and sort of move them out of that wild roadless category and into industrial forest lands, just like other Forest Service lands are managed.
So if this rule goes through, it's in a public comment period, but if it does go through, what would it mean for these places? Let's start with you, Steve.
I think the really troubling thing is it would mean they'd go into the timber base and be managed like other industrial logging lands. The Forest Service is currently getting direction from the current presidential administration that they need to prioritize logging over other uses of public lands. And I think the idea of places like Lost Lake or Larch Mountain being managed for commercial logging is pretty shocking to most people in Oregon who love places like that, and we understand that they're important for drinking water, for wildlife habitat, and for our tourism and recreation economy. People don't come to Oregon to go hiking in a logging sale. They come to Oregon to see the scenic views in places like the Cascade Lakes, and I really am hopeful that the public is going to respond to this pretty negatively. The roadless rule has been in place for 20 years. It's not a hugely controversial issue until now.
Did you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think it's really important for people to understand the nature of a national forest. Oftentimes, people are confused in thinking that national forests are much like national parks. You, of course, would not expect to see a commercial timber sale in Crater Lake National Park, for example. But in national forests, again, these are federally owned lands, so they belong to all Americans. But national forests are managed under the National Forest Management Act for multiple purposes, multiple use. And that can include commercial timber harvest and other sorts of economic uses. In order to allow for commercial timber sales, that land has to be in what the Forest Service calls the commercial timber base. And that's a key thing that this roadless rule did, is to say, we will not manage, as the U.S. Forest Service that manages this land on behalf of all Americans, we will not manage these areas for commercial timber harvest purposes. The second Trump administration has, as Steve noted, has sort of released an edict to the Forest Service to greatly increase commercial timber harvest on national forest lands. So, everyone's national forests, they need to understand that these lands are managed for multiple purposes. And the Trump administration has essentially said, we are going to emphasize timber harvest, and we're going into these areas that have been protected for 25 years or so now in our drive to increase timber harvest.
So the head of the U.S. Department of Agriculture formally announced this proposed termination of the rule, saying this would remove, quote, burdensome, outdated, one-size-fits-all regulations that not only put people and livelihoods at risk, but also stifle economic growth in rural America. She's calling this a common sense management of our national forest lands because it puts the management on local jurisdictions and can help to reduce the forest fires that endanger rural communities. Dan, can you explain, the context of this tug of war over this use of land in this case?
Sure. I think there are some things that I think the agricultural secretary doesn't entirely, I think, misstates to some degree. So, for example, when the Secretary of Agriculture talks about local control, that's sort of a suggestion that, counties or, the city of Bend or something like that will somehow be, controlling management of forests in that area. And that's certainly not true. These lands will continue to be managed by the U.S. Forest Service, which is a federal agency. And in fact, as I said before, that federal agency is now sort of responding to these marching orders from Washington, D.C. to substantially increase timber harvest on national forests. So I think that edict is coming down more from Washington, D.C.
I see. I want to ask, just because we're limited on time, but I wanted to ask you, Steve, of course we mentioned and we heard the secretary there, the Department of Agriculture head, say that this could help with fighting fires. Of course, Oregon and Washington absolutely devastated by fires, especially in recent years. It's been really difficult to see that. How do you think this would play a role in firefighting efforts?
I actually think this would probably make the firefighting issues in the Northwest worse. One of the things we know nationally is most fire starts happen because of humans. It's still unattended campfire, it's someone shooting off fireworks in the Columbia Gorge, or someone leaving a campfire unattended, or riding an ATV someplace they shouldn't be. When you build more roads in an area, you're creating more potential for those kinds of fire starts. And on top of that, the reason these places are roadless is they're hard to get to right now. These are places that it's difficult, you have to hike or ride a horse or ride a mountain bike to get into these places. And that tends to make them the kinds of places you probably don't want to prioritize for firefighting because they're remote and difficult to get to. You probably want to prioritize areas around homes and communities. And to my view and read on this is that this is really about shifting the management of these places to commercial logging. And fire is sort of being invoked as a reason to do that because that sounds better than saying we're just going to take roadless areas around Lost Lake and put them back in the timber base. I think if we're serious about addressing fire risk in the Pacific Northwest, we really need to focus on that question of what are we doing with prescribed fire, what are we doing with thinning in and around homes and communities where the highest priority should be.
Also, I think the law is relevant here. The current roadless rule does allow for thinning within roadless areas, so within these otherwise protected areas. There can be timber management in order to reduce the risk of catastrophic wildfire. So that provision already exists in managing roadless areas. And so, as Steve suggested, I think, when the secretary talks about removing burdensome regulations, those regulations are primarily burdensome on commercial timber harvest. And so I think this rule is clearly directed at increasing commercial timber harvest.
So that leads to my next question. So if this rule goes through, who benefits from this?
Certainly the timber industry will benefit, and the timber industry traditionally has been an important economic player in the Northwest, where we have some of the most valuable commercial timberland, both private as well as federal timberland. So commercial timber interests would certainly benefit.
I also wonder, I know you talked about it a little bit, but I think when people think, okay, we're going to, make this land more available for local jurisdictions or state oversight, would there be any place where the state of Oregon would be able to pick up this land and step in and have that local kind of oversight, or is that just under the law not feasible?
No, because it's federal land, and the decisions about how to manage this land are made at a federal level. Now, there may be, timber companies in the Northwest that sort of have the ear of the administration that are saying, hey, we'd love to see some more commercial timber harvest. So in that sense, this rule would be responsive to those local economic interests, but still the decisions about managing the land, how much and where timber sales are going to occur, those decisions are all being made by federal agencies.
I might add to that, I think another thing to bear in mind when we talk about the Forest Service and the lands they manage, we tend to lose sight of these are public lands. They belong to all Americans. And there's actually a pretty unique thing we have as Americans. There are places like the Forest Service lands around Mount Hood or in the Clackamas watershed or in the Sayusa National Forest over on the coast where we can go and recreate. We're not paying generally for the privilege of doing that. We have the ability to go and use and access these lands. The state of Oregon just isn't remotely financially equipped to take on the management of the lands or those kinds of activities. And I think one of the dangers that we see in that kind of rhetoric from the current presidential administration is, that is a slippery slope to, well, if a state like Utah, for instance, were able to get a bunch of public lands transferred to them and they don't have the money to manage them, what's going to happen to them? Are those lands still going to be open to the public? Will the future generations of people who want to go hike or camp or ride their mountain bikes still be able to do that? And I think, the short answer is probably not.
It's interesting, before we came onto the show, you were mentioning that you were part of Oregon Wild through the Bush administration's attempt to do away with the roadless rule. Is it similar? Are there parallels to that time to now, or is it different?
I think it's a little bit different. My take is, while we frequently disagreed with the George W. Bush administration on environmental policy, there was generally a lot of consensus on public lands and goals. And I would say in that administration, a lot of respect for the legacy of Teddy Roosevelt and the very Republican political idea. Public lands really started as a concept in America with Teddy Roosevelt. That's changed. I don't think there's a lot of respect for the idea that these Forest Service lands belong to all Americans, that they should be managed for all Americans, they should be managed as a legacy for future generations. The idea that big wild places that are still wild today in 2025, we still have big roadless areas where we can go and explore wild landscapes where nature is still in charge. There's just not a lot of respect for that as a value worth protecting.
As far as next steps moving forward, do you see this going through, and do you see other maybe patterns of deregulation coming from the federal administration like this one?
Sure, I think everything that we've heard from the Trump administration indicates that it is very determined to get rid of the roadless rule. And I'm pretty confident that it will follow through in doing that because across the board, especially in the environmental context, this Trump administration has been very determined to get rid of what it calls burdensome regulations. The initial public comment period for the roadless rule is very truncated, so the administration seems to be going forward very quickly. I think we will see renewed litigation when the roadless rule is repealed. And so the various parties will be back in court. But I also think this is a broader pattern. If you look, from everything from climate policy to public lands policy, polluting industries, coal-fired power plants, et cetera, literally have been able to get out of EPA regulations with an email. They sent an email, hey, let us out of these regulations, boom. So I think that's something we've seen across the board from the Trump administration.
Is this something in the environmental law field? What are the things that you're talking about the most right now?
Certainly climate policy. The federal government just came out with a climate report that basically said, climate change, no big deal. It was written by 5 hand-picked climate skeptics. It was met by an even longer report from academic scientists basically saying this has no scientific validity. People are talking about other environmental rollbacks where the Environmental Protection Agency is allowing higher levels of pollution that will affect many communities. We've seen it in public lands where even Congress has suggested taking public lands that are owned by all Americans and either giving them to the states or selling them off. And I think, as Steve mentioned, that's something fairly unique to the United States, that many of us own millions of acres of land, or we do collectively. And changing that would be a dramatically different step. So we've seen really paradigm shifting moves in this administration.
Dan Rolfe, thank you so much for being here. Steve Pettery, appreciate both of your
Thank
time
you.
today. Well, if you would like to weigh in, the USDA is seeking public comment, as we mentioned, on this intended change through September 19th. You can submit your comment through the Federal Register. We have a link to that on our website at kgw.com/Straight Talk. We'll see you right after this.